It could be worse. My father seemed convinced that he could fix the furnace. This was not a new conviction. He had been convinced of this for what I estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 years, give or take a century. I had stopped counting after the first few hundred. After that, it felt unnecessary, like keeping track of how many times you breathed or how many steps you took walking down a familiar hallway. Some things you just did, over and over, until the doing became the only reality that mattered. The furnace sat in the basement of our house, on Maple Street, a squat monster of cast iron and rust that radiated a perpetual, not quite warmth throughout the rooms above. It had been installed, according to the brass plate riveted to its side, by the Henderson Brothers Heating Company of Toledo, Ohio, in 1947. This was also, coincidentally, the year we had died, though my father never made the connection aloud. He treated the furnace like any other appliance that required maintenance, scheduled attention, and the kind of patient, methodical problem-solving he had once applied to his job at the insurance company before. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, after what passed for dinner in our house, my father would descend the basement stairs with his toolbox and spend exactly 90 minutes working on the furnace. He would remove panels, examine pipes, and make small adjustments with wrenches that seemed purpose-built for this particular monstrosity. He kept a logbook, where he recorded his observations in careful block letters. Replaced gasket, south intake valve. Recalibrated pressure regulator. Tightened mounting bracket, furnace body, northwest quadrant. The furnace never worked properly. It never had. But it never stopped working entirely either, which I suppose was its own kind of success. I don't remember when I first understood where we were. I only remember that by the time I did, it was already too late to be surprised. The realization had come gradually, like noticing that a crack in the ceiling had grown longer over time, which it had repeatedly, despite my father's attempts to patch it. The crack would disappear for a while, smoothed over with joint compound and paint, and then it would return, slightly different in shape, but unmistakably the same crack, running from the light fixture in the dining room toward the corner, where the wallpaper never quite adhered to the wall, no matter how much paste my mother applied. We lived at 447 Maple Street, in a neighborhood that looked exactly like every other middle-class suburb in America in the years following the war. Ranch houses with small front lawns, sidewalks that buckled slightly, where tree roots had pushed up through the concrete. A corner grocery where Mr. Fenwick sold penny candy and cigarettes and kept a radio playing behind the counter, always tuned to the same station, always playing the same songs. Our house had 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with yellow Formica counters, and a living room where we gathered every evening to listen to the Philco radio console that my father maintained with the same dedication he applied to the furnace. My mother kept house. This was what she did, what she had always done, and the fact that she happened to be doing it in a place that she steadfastly refused to let us call by its proper name did not alter her commitment to the task. She made meals according to a rotation that never varied. Monday was meatloaf. Tuesday was pork chops. Wednesday was chicken, though Wednesday dinners were always late because Wednesday was the day they took my mother's hands, and it was difficult to prepare a meal without hands. They always reappeared on Thursday morning. But for all of Wednesday, she was mildly annoyed at how much longer her chores took, with no hands. Everyone knew to be on their best behavior every Wednesday or there would be, well, heck to pay. The meatloaf always had roaches in it. Not many, just 2 or 3. Their dark shells visible in the cross-section when my father sliced the loaf at the table. My mother would scrape them out with her fork and continue serving, commenting that protein was protein, and we should be grateful for what we had. "We're lucky, really," she said one Monday evening, removing a particularly large roach from my brother's portion. "At least we still have each other." You should see what they're doing to the McAllisters. I had asked once what was being done to the McAllisters. My mother had given me a look that suggested the question was in poor taste and changed the subject to my brother's posture at the table, which she felt needed immediate improvement. My brother was 7 years old. He had been 7 years old in 1947 when our Hudson Commodore had slid on wet leaves and hit the bridge abutment on Route 23. and he had remained 7 years old ever since. His name was Danny, and he approached each day with a kind of earnest optimism that I found both touching and utterly exhausting. He believed that tomorrow might be better. He believed that next Christmas might be different. He believed that if he was good, really good, things would improve. I had believed this once too, I suppose. I couldn't remember when I had stopped. "Do you think the furnace will be fixed soon?" Danny asked one evening at dinner. This was a Thursday, which meant we were having fish sticks and creamed corn, with tiny rocks mixed in, and my father had already excused himself to begin his work in the basement. "Your father is doing his best," my mother said, which was not an answer. "But it's been making that sound again," Danny said. "The rattling. Remember when it didn't rattle for a while? It was so quiet I thought maybe he'd finally figured it out." He was right. The furnace had, for a brief period approximately 6 years earlier, or possibly 60, operated with unusual smoothness. My father had been quietly triumphant, permitting himself a small smile at dinner and making a note in his logbook with a flourish and a particular satisfaction. The silence had lasted for perhaps 3 weeks before the rattling returned, slightly different in pitch, but unmistakably present, and my father had sighed and reached for his toolbox. "These things take time," my mother said, collecting our plates. "Your father knows what he's doing." Danny nodded, accepting this, because Danny always accepted these things. I said nothing, because I had learned that saying nothing was generally the safest policy, and returned to my room to read the same issue of Popular Mechanics that had been sitting on my nightstand for longer than I cared to calculate. The magazine was dated October 1947. It featured articles about television, atomic energy, and a revolutionary new kitchen appliance called a Disposal that would change American life forever. I had read every article so many times I could recite them from memory. I read them anyway, because the alternative was staring at the ceiling and counting the cracks, which I'd also done so many times I could draw a detailed map from memory. On Sundays we went to church. This was non-negotiable. My mother laid out our good clothes on Saturday evening. My father's gray suit and my clip-on tie, Danny's miniature version of the same, and we walked the 4 blocks to First Methodist. It always rained during our walk to the church, but it would invariably clear up the moment we stepped inside. Reverend Patterson delivered sermons about grace and redemption and the mysterious ways in which the Lord worked. At least, that's what I think he was saying. It was difficult to hear him over the laughter from the back row of pews. Everyone ignored it, but it was the same every Sunday. A lone man in the last pew just laughing uncontrollably throughout the entire sermon. It was a raucous, echoing, knee-slapping, really, he actually slapped his knee repeatedly, kind of laughter. After the sermon, the congregation sang hymns, passed collection plates, and shook hands during the fellowship hour while drinking gray, watery coffee from styrofoam cups. Everyone was very pleasant. Everyone was very normal. Nobody ever mentioned where we were, though I was certain that everyone understood. It was simply not discussed, in the same way my mother did not permit us to use certain words at the dinner table because there were children present, never mind that the children in question had been children for centuries, and showed no signs of progressing from that status. I had almost said it once. The word. I had been standing in the kitchen watching my mother scrape roaches from the meatloaf, and the word had risen to my lips with such force I had to physically bite down to keep it from escaping. My mother had glanced at me, something flickering in her eyes that might have been understanding or might have been warning, and then she had returned to her work, and the moment had passed. I never tried again. Christmas came every year with the same ritual precision. My father would retrieve the boxes from the basement, the artificial tree with its slightly bent branches, the ornaments individually wrapped in tissue paper, the string of lights that required exactly 47 minutes to untangle. Danny would help, or try to help, his enthusiasm making the work take longer, but my father never complained, never suggested that Danny do something else. My mother would bake cookies using a recipe that called for ingredients we never seemed to have quite enough of, resulting in cookies that were always slightly salty, sour, or just wrong in texture and flavor, but which we ate anyway and complimented appropriately. The tree went up in the corner of the living room, where it had always gone, positioned to be visible from the street. Though no one ever walked past our house, except the same armless mailman who delivered the same junk mail, past due bills, and circulars every day. Danny would decorate with careful attention, hanging each ornament in what he considered the optimal position, stepping back to evaluate his work with the seriousness of an artist. And then, on Christmas morning, we would gather around the tree to open presents. There were always presents, wrapped in paper that looked expensive but felt cheap, and always resulted in several painful paper cuts, tied with moldy ribbons that frayed at the edges. Danny would open his first, pulling away paper to reveal items that were never quite what he had hoped for. A toy fire truck with wheels that didn't turn. A train set that screamed when you touched it. A coloring book with pages that depicted the most banal or disturbing scenes imaginable. A middle-aged man sitting quietly in an armchair staring at nothing. Or possibly a house cat disemboweling a child that looked to be about Danny's age. A puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together quite right, and that, if you ever did manage to get them to fit, was always missing one piece. My presents were similar. Books I had already read. I had, at last count, 167 copies of Robinson Crusoe, games with critical pieces missing, a jacket that was always slightly too small or too large, or had a severed human finger in one of the pockets. My parents exchanged presents with each other too. A new potholder, a cookbook written in a language that none of us knew, or a pair of socks that dissolved when exposed to warmth for my mother. A set of screwdrivers, or a necktie made of human flesh for my father. They would thank each other with a kind of practiced courtesy that suggested this exchange had occurred so many times it had achieved the status of liturgy. My mother often reminding us that it's the thought that counts. And in the branches of the tree, among the ornaments and the lights, there were always snakes. Small ones, mostly. Garter snakes and grass snakes coiled around the branches or draped across the strings of lights, occasionally dropping to the floor where my mother would sweep them out the door with the same broom she used for dust and the crushed bodies of insects. Danny had stopped commenting on the snakes years ago, or decades ago, accepting their presence the way he accepted roaches in the meatloaf and the persistent rattle of the furnace. They were simply part of Christmas, no more remarkable than tinsel or candy canes. I remembered my first Christmas here, when the snakes had seemed horrifying, impossible, wrong. I remembered Danny crying, my mother's tight-lipped insistence that we would open presents as planned, my father calmly removing snakes from the branches and depositing them outside before returning to help Danny open his gifts. The memory felt distant now, faded, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Now I simply watched as a small brown snake wound its way around a silver ball ornament, its scales catching the light, and I thought about how adaptation was perhaps the cruelest gift we had been given in this place. The house itself seemed to resist our efforts at maintenance in ways both subtle and overt. The crack in the dining room ceiling would be repaired and would return. The wallpaper in the hallway would peel and be replaced, only to peel again in exactly the same pattern. The screen door would develop a tear that my father would patch with a small square of mesh, and the tear would reappear 6 months later, or 6 years later, in the same location. We owned a 1947 Hudson Commodore, the same model we had been driving when we died, kept in the garage, though we never drove it. My father would start the engine every Saturday morning, letting it run for exactly 15 minutes, and then shut it off. The car never left the garage. The garage door never opened. But every Saturday, my father would go through this ritual, checking fluid levels, examining belts and hoses, making notes in another notebook that was identical to the furnace logbook. Sometimes I wondered if the car worked. Sometimes I wondered if we could drive it away from here, if we wanted to. I had never asked. I suspected my father had never tried. There were rules in this place, unspoken and unwritten, and one of those rules seemed to be that you could maintain things, but you could not change them, that you could go through the motions of life, but you couldn't actually live, that you could exist here forever in this state of preserved normalcy, repeating the same days and weeks and years until the repetition became indistinguishable from eternity. My mother said things could be worse. She said this often, usually when something had broken or failed or gone wrong in one of the small ways that things constantly went wrong in our house. She said we were fortunate to have each other, to have a home, to have meals and clothing and all the comforts of modern American life. She said we should count our blessings. She was right, probably. Things could be worse. I had seen evidence of this, heard whispers at church, and noticed the empty houses on our street that had once contained families who were no longer there. The McAllisters were gone now. So were the Hendersons. The Kowalskis had disappeared one Sunday, their house standing empty, their lawn gradually growing wild until something cut it back to regulation height, and it resumed its normal appearance as if the Kowalskis had never existed. We remained. We continued. We maintained. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, my father worked on the furnace. On Mondays, my mother made meatloaf. On Wednesdays, they took her hands. On Sundays, we went to church. And every day I woke in my narrow bed in my narrow room and looked at the ceiling and counted the cracks I had counted 10,000 times before and would count 10,000 times again. I had a friend once, or I thought I had. A boy named Michael who lived 3 houses down and who I played catch with in the street on summer evenings when the heat made the asphalt soft and sticky. Michael was 12, or had been 12 when he died, and we would throw a baseball back and forth, neither of us very good at it, while our mothers watched from their respective porches and called reminders about staying in the yard and watching for cars that never came. One day, Michael didn't come out. His house was dark. The next day I walked past and saw that the lawn had grown tall, the hedges wild, and I understood that Michael was gone. I didn't ask where. I knew better than to ask questions like that. After Michael left, I stopped playing catch. There was no one else to play with. Danny was too young, or too permanently young, and the other children in the neighborhood, the few that remained, kept to themselves with a kind of wariness that suggested they understood the rules even if they couldn't articulate them. So I read my magazine. I counted cracks. I helped my father with the furnace on those occasions when he requested assistance, usually to hold a flashlight or hand him a tool, though I knew my help made no difference. The furnace would rattle or hiss or leak or fail in whatever way it was going to fail, and my father would address the problem with the same patient determination he had always shown, and the problem would temporarily abate before returning in a slightly different form. On a Tuesday in what might have been early spring, though seasons were somewhat negotiable in our neighborhood, my father called me down to the basement to help him with the furnace. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what he said when I arrived at the bottom of the stairs. "Hand me the 3/4-inch socket," he said, which was normal, and I found it in the toolbox and handed it to him. He attached it to the ratchet, positioned it on a bolt, and paused. "Do you know what I did before?" he asked. "Before we came here?" I nodded. "You worked at the insurance company." "That's right. I evaluated risk. I looked at numbers, at probabilities, at the likelihood of certain events occurring, and I determined what premium should be charged to account for those risks. I was good at it. I had a head for numbers." He turned the ratchet, the bolt loosening with a satisfying click. "The thing about risk," he continued, "is that it's never really about what happens. It's about what could happen. It's about preparing for eventualities, maintaining systems that can withstand stress. You understand?" I said I understood, though I wasn't certain I did. "This furnace," he said, removing the bolt and setting it carefully in a small container with other identical bolts, "will never be completely fixed. I know that. I've known it for a long time. But if I don't maintain it, if I don't keep working on it, then what am I?" He looked at me then, and his eyes held something I couldn't quite identify. Not sadness, exactly. Not resignation. Something else. "What else am I supposed to do?" he asked. I had no answer for him. He nodded as if my silence had confirmed something, and returned to his work, removing another bolt, checking a gasket, and making a note in his logbook. I held the flashlight until he was finished, and then we went upstairs for dinner, which was fish sticks because it was Thursday. That night I lay in bed and thought about my father's question. What else was he supposed to do? What else were any of us supposed to do? We couldn't leave. We couldn't change. We couldn't even properly name where we were without violating rules that were never stated but always enforced. All we could do was continue, maintain, persist in the rituals and routines that gave our existence the appearance of life, even if the substance had long since drained away. I thought about saying something. About standing up at dinner and saying the word my mother had forbidden, about forcing everyone to acknowledge what we all knew but never spoke. I thought about refusing to help my father with the furnace, about telling him it was pointless, that nothing he did would ever make a difference. I thought about asking Danny why he still hoped, what he still believed in, what kept him from seeing what I saw every time I looked around our small house, with its permanent crack and its roach-filled meatloaf and its Christmas tree full of snakes. But I said nothing. I got up the next morning and ate breakfast, Kellogg's Corn Flakes with milk that always tasted slightly sour, and I helped my mother with the dishes, and I read my magazine, and I waited for dinner, and the day after that was exactly the same, except it wasn't, quite. Because that Saturday, when my father started the Hudson in the garage, the engine caught on the first try and ran with a smoothness I had never heard before. Danny noticed it too, pausing in the driveway where he was bouncing a not-quite-round ball against the garage door, listening to the steady purr of the engine. "It sounds good," Danny said, his face brightening. "It sounds really good. Do you hear it?" I heard it. My father heard it too. He let the engine run for its customary 15 minutes. And for those 15 minutes, the car ran perfectly. Not a rattle, not a hesitation. Just the smooth mechanical confidence of an engine operating exactly as designed. When my father shut it off, Danny was practically vibrating with excitement. "You fixed it," Danny said. "You really fixed it this time." My father said nothing, but he patted the hood of the car with something that might have been satisfaction. And we went inside for lunch, and Danny talked all through the meal about how the car was fixed now, how everything was better now, how maybe this meant other things could be fixed too. The following Saturday, the engine ran rough again. Not as bad as before, but the smoothness was gone, replaced by a familiar uneven idle and a slight knocking sound that made my father frown and reach for his notebook. Danny's face fell. He looked at my father, then at me, then back at the car, and I watched the hope drain from him like water from a cracked vase. He didn't say anything. He just picked up his ball and went back to bouncing it against the garage door, and I understood that something had broken in him that was more significant than anything mechanical. But 3 days later, at dinner, he was talking about how maybe next week the car would run well again. How maybe it just needed time. How maybe if we were patient, things would improve. And I realized that hope was not something that could be permanently broken in Danny, that it would regenerate like my mother's hands on Thursday mornings, appearing fresh and new no matter how many times it was taken away. I envied him, in a way. I envied his capacity to believe that tomorrow might be different, that the next Christmas might not have snakes, that the furnace might finally be fixed for good. I had lost that capacity somewhere in the uncounted years, had traded it for the clarity of understanding, and I wasn't certain that I had gotten the better deal. The seasons changed, or appeared to change, autumn giving way to winter, giving way to spring in a cycle that was consistent in its repetition, if nothing else. The leaves fell and were raked. The snow came and was shoveled. The grass grew and was mowed. We went to church. We ate dinner. We maintained our house and our car and our furnace and ourselves, keeping everything in working order even though nothing ever truly worked. And one evening, I don't remember which evening because they all blurred together after a while, I was helping my father in the basement with the furnace, holding the flashlight while he examined something deep in the machine's interior, when I realized that I had become him. Not physically, I was still trapped in the body of a child, but mentally, emotionally, I had become my father. I was going through motions because the alternative was not going through motions. And not going through motions meant confronting the reality that there were no motions worth going through, and that confrontation would make continuation impossible. So I held the flashlight. I handed him tools. I made notes in my own mental logbook about the futility of maintenance, about the careful preservation of routines that led nowhere, about the way we all conspired to pretend that what we were doing mattered when we all knew it didn't. My mother called down that dinner was ready. It was Monday, which meant meatloaf. We went upstairs and washed our hands. Though my father's were already clean, he always kept them clean, and we sat at the table in our usual places, and my mother served the meal and we ate it, roaches and all, and Danny asked if I wanted to play catch later, and I said maybe, though we both knew I wouldn't. After dinner, my father returned to the basement. This was not his scheduled furnace day, but he went anyway, and I could hear him down there. The soft clink of tools, The creak of the basement stairs as he shifted position. The quiet industry of a man maintaining something that could not be maintained in a place that could not be escaped. Danny asked if tomorrow might be better. He asked this often, phrasing it differently. But the question was always the same, and my mother always gave him the same answer, that tomorrow would be what it would be, and we would face it together, and we should be grateful for what we had. I looked at the crack in the ceiling. It had grown again, I noticed. Just a little, barely visible unless you knew where to look. My father would patch it soon. It would disappear, and then it would return, because that was what cracks did in this place. They returned. They persisted. They reminded us that nothing we fixed stayed fixed, that all our effort was temporary at best and meaningless at worst. But we would patch it anyway. We would keep patching it, keep repairing, keep maintaining, because the alternative was sitting still and watching everything decay. And that was somehow worse than the pretense of progress. My mother cleared the dishes. Danny asked again about playing catch. My father's tools clinked in the basement. The furnace rattled, a sound so familiar it was almost comforting. And I thought about how easily we adapted to horror, how quickly the impossible became routine, how the mind could normalize anything given enough time and enough repetition. That's the thing about where we were, what we had become. My mother was right when she said things could be worse. She was right when she said we were lucky, relatively speaking, compared to the McAllisters or the Hendersons or whoever else had vanished into whatever worse place existed beyond our small house on our small street in our small corner of eternity. But being lucky didn't mean being good. It just meant being less bad. And less bad, when stretched across forever, still added up to more suffering than any reasonable universe should permit. I didn't say this, of course. I helped my mother with the dishes. I told Danny maybe tomorrow for catch, and I saw the hope in his face and felt something twist in my chest that might have been affection or might have been grief. I went to my room and read my magazine and counted my cracks, and waited for sleep that would come eventually, as it always did, only to deliver me to another morning identical to this one, and the thousands that had come before it. In the basement, my father worked on the furnace. Tomorrow was Tuesday, his scheduled maintenance day, but he was down there anyway, and I understood that the schedule didn't really matter, that the work was the point, that keeping busy was the only thing standing between us and the full weight of understanding where we were and what that meant. So he worked, and my mother cleaned, and Danny hoped. And I counted cracks and read magazines and helped hold flashlights when requested. And the furnace rattled on, never quite breaking, never quite fixed. Just like everything else in our life that wasn't really life at all, but was close enough to life that we could pretend, if we didn't look too closely, that we were still living it.